Alan Wake 2 was announced at the Game Awards recently. I don't think I need to tell anyone in Remedy's orbit that this was massive news for fans of the series. Alan Wake is something of a cultural legend, releasing in 2010, performing incredibly critically from both reviewers and audiences, only to sell poorly in the years that followed. Due to this, despite the great word of mouth the game generated, Microsoft decided to turn down the idea of a sequel. And so, for about a decade, Alan Wake has been stuck in Cauldron Lake, his only glimmer of hope being his appearance in Control's DLC, AWE. But now, we have confirmation that Alan Wake has finally written Escape from his otherworldly confinement, just ready and waiting for 2023. But what can we expect from the game? After all, every Remedy game in the past 15 years or so have been pretty similar in their gameplay, but completely different in almost every aspect of their existence. So today, we're going to be having a look at just what to expect from this sequel, in terms of both gameplay and story. Let's dive in. One of the few concrete details about Alan Wake 2 we currently have is the knowledge that it is a survival horror game. Sounds simple enough, right? Well, not entirely. Survival horror is one of those genres where it's very difficult to actually define what the average gameplay is. In a similar vein to genres like action or RPGs, the name doesn't make much sense. Almost every game has some form of action, or have you take the role of a character, and almost every horror game has you survive against something, whether that be a zombie plague or the monsters of your mind. Obviously, the phrase survival horror will probably cause most people to think of a series like Resident Evil, the franchise that coined the term in the first place. But even that is more complicated than it may seem. Resident Evil may have started out with each game following the same formula, but since Resident Evil 4 in 2005, many different gameplay styles have appeared, with some being more psychological while others are more action focused. Even games like The Last of Us, Five Nights at Freddy's and Until Dawn have claimed to be survival horror games, and they couldn't be more different to each other. Matters were only complicated more when Sam Lake, writer for most of Remedy's games, claimed during the announcement of Alan Wake 2 that the original game was an action game with horror elements. Really? While I do believe that horror is subjective, and it's completely possible you may just not find Alan Wake scary at all, I think it fits the horror genre better than the action genre. It actually has a lot of the hallmarks of a survival horror, in the likeness of a Silent Hill / early Resident Evil game, limited resources and a focus on narrative. So, if the original Alan Wake gives you enough tools to cause the horror to turn into action, then just what can we expect the sequel to change to make the player more helpless? The biggest gimmick Alan Wake has is the light system. By forcing the player to strip away the taken sealed darkness before they can be put down permanently, the game manages to set itself apart from the crowd while keeping the player on their toes. By making it so the only thing guaranteeing that the townspeople around you aren't about to turn heel and start attacking you is the fact that the dark place is just unable to possess them in the light. It keeps this depressing atmosphere that anyone friendly you meet could just as easily be trying to kill you just a few hours later. A sequel could really take this idea that no one you meet is a guaranteed friend and pump it up to 11. If we look at the alpha versions of Alan Wake, we can see that for a fairly long time, the game had you take a more proactive role in keeping the residents of Brightfall safe from the dark presence, by asking you to build up defences during the day before the taken arrive once night falls. Imagine if the sequel built upon this idea, where you had to decide who you could afford to save during the day due to your limited resources, with each survivor having some pre-designated resistance to the Dark Presence's influence. While the survivor might be useful during the day, once the taken arrive, you could find yourself with opposition from both sides, as the ones you trusted are, well, taken. Remedy has said that Alan Wake was supposed to be more open antithesis to the linear levels of the Max Payne games, and while the original obviously never ended up going this direction because of complications behind the scenes, a sequel could be the perfect place to build upon this idea. While gameplay is obviously important to a game, it's never been what Remedy is most known for. When you think Remedy, you think story, and Alan Wake 2 seems poised to go deeper into the psyche than any of their prior games. Alan Wake 2 is rated M, as opposed to the T rating of the original, meaning Sam Lake and his team will be going darker than their previous games. Secondly, Remedy seems more creatively free under Epic than Microsoft, who are often said to offer improvements to what Remedy was doing. So, we're evidently getting a darker and creepier story than the original, but what can we actually expect to happen? Despite being a sequel to the original, and a continuation of the event setup in Control, Sam Lake has clarified that Alan Wake 2 will not require the player to have played either prior game to get a basic understanding of what's going on. This leads us to two conclusions. Either Remedy will reintroduce characters and plot points from the original game, meaning both new players and veterans can get a basic explanation of who these characters are and what they've been doing in the decade between the games, or alternatively, the game will act almost as a self-contained story, with a new cast of side characters in new locales. While the trailer does show Bright Falls and what we can presume are the woods of Washington surrounding it, this city, which many have said to be New York, is new to the Wake side of the universe. I feel Remedy will likely lean towards the former option, with influences from the latter, featuring the returns of characters like Seraph Breaker, Barry Wheeler and Jesse Faden, but with the arrival of a few new characters. We likely already know one of these, FBC agent Estevez. According to notes scattered around the investigation sector of the oldest house, we know Estevez was still situated at a post in Bright Falls when the Hiss invasion took place, and when the alert of an AWE taking place there several years in the future comes through, Agent Estevez is said to be on site at that time, ready to give further updates. It is almost certain that he will appear as a new major protagonist, serving almost as a human connection tying the two branches of the Remedyverse together. Talking of the FBC, just how likely is it that other members of the organisation will appear throughout the game? Honestly, as much as I do adore Control, I can't see many of the characters from that game physically appearing in Alan Wake 2. While the FBC did take significant losses during the Hiss invasion, that took place in 2019, and if we assume that Alan Wake 2 takes place in 2022, like the AWE alert says, they've had 3 years in which to rebuild. Also, we must remember that this is a survival horror game, and one of the most important parts of horror is making sure that the characters are never powerful enough to ruin the tension. It's safe to say that a highly trained group of federal agents, backed up by a director who can throw forklifts several meters with a mind and sit-sats with Lovecraftian entities on the daily, would likely be sufficient to break this most important of rules. I can see the player somehow having communication with the FBC throughout the game though, perhaps through Estevez's monitoring station, and the sudden appearance of Jesse and company could make for an interesting ending to the game, especially if Remedy wanted Wake to regularly interact with them in the future. But what about the characters from the original Alan Wake? Frankly, if I find out that the veritable legend that is the one Barry Wheeler somehow does not make an appearance in this sequel, my entire opinion in the game could be ruined before it comes out. Well, Wheeler fans, you're in luck. Alan Wake 2's announcement on Twitter was retweeted by Poets of the Fall, who may know more as the Old Gods of Asgard. So far, every Remedy-verse since Alan Wake has featured at least one Old God song, and Barry Wheeler is now the new manager of the band, so if the Old Gods appear in the sequel, Wheeler is unlikely to be far behind. Wheeler has also kept in contact with other supporting characters from the original game in the decade Alan's been in the lake, having continued a friendship with Sarah Breaker and mending his relationship with Alice. Alice is essentially locked in to appear, with most of Alan's story being either to save or reunite with her, so she could be seen almost as the end goal of the game in a strange sense. Breaker is also fairly likely, if only due to her status as the only competent combatant against the Taken in Bright Falls, as well as her links to the FBC. So finally, we have to figure out which paranatural entities may appear throughout Alan Wake 2. Since Control in 2019, we've learned that the horrors taking place throughout Alan Wake's adventures are not just not a one-off, but a relatively common occurrence in the town of Bright Falls, with unknowable entities from dimensions impossible for the human mind to fully conceive, manipulating the very fabric of reality. When it comes to Alan though, there's one entity who is practically a package deal, the Dark Presence. Hailing from the Dark Place, which is connected to our plane of existence through a portal in a cauldron lake, the Dark Presence's current body was destroyed at the end of Alan Wake, but when talking about an enemy as powerful as themselves, it's unlikely that this would be anything less than a temporary setback. If they were to reappear in the sequel, they'd likely be adhering to both the gameplay and setup of the original game, using the Taken as physical manifestations of their will to try and force Wake into writing them an escape from the Dark Place. While under any other circumstances, I'd say that the Dark Presence is a near guarantee for the sequel, there are small pieces of information that make me think this isn't so certain. Firstly, the Dark Presence, as of the current status quo, has completed their purpose. If Alan Wake is a near perfect representation of the hero's journey, then the Dark Presence essentially acts as a physical manifestation of the trials and tribulations the hero overcomes as they progress. If Alan Wake is a metaphor for the difficulty of creating a story, the Dark Presence fills the same role, representing the trials and tribulations that a writer must overcome to create their story. Even if we take Alan Wake at its most surface level, then the Dark Presence has still been defeated, their emotional links to Alan taken away, and their grip on him only temporary. From a story perspective, even if the Dark Presence is technically still around, being the main antagonistic force in the second game would likely cause it to tread mostly the same ground as in the first, and could lead to the game feeling redundant. As much as the light system is unique for enemies, many of the reviews for the recent remaster seems to agree about how it hasn't exactly aged well, feeling slow and unwieldy, especially in contrast to the fast-paced frenetic combat of Control. Secondly, Sam Lake has mentioned in press interviews that the Dark Presence isn't the worst thing living in the Dark Place. This will most likely mean that even if the Dark Presence is in the game affecting gameplay, they will likely take the role of a temporary villain at the start of the game before the new threat arises, or they'll end up almost as a lieutenant/officer for this new threat. If they took this path, then the Dark Presence could still ease the player into the motions of an Alan Wake game before the rug is pulled from under their feet with a new enemy that comes with a more sophisticated gameplay loop to keep up with a more modern gaming experience. Another paranatural entity that seems certain to appear in the sequel is this Primal Wake we see at the end of the trailer. Now, this isn't the first time we've seen this feral Alan in the Remedyverse. There are a possible 2 points where he may have already popped up, and it depends on whether it is Mr. Scratch or not. Mr. Scratch was the main antagonist of Alan Wake's American Nightmare, a sort of sequel to Alan Wake, where he appears as a murderous doppelganger of Wake, who's been warped by the general public's negative perception of what they believe to be Alan. I'm not going to go into specifics here, but at the end of American Nightmare, Mr. Scratch is seemingly destroyed. Considering that Mr. Scratch is seemingly much weaker than the Dark Presence, it seemed unlikely that he survived this, but theories started to appear about how he survived thanks to a document found in AWE, discussing how Alice has been seeing dark apparitions of Alan tormenting her once night falls. We know this isn't Alan doing this, as he never intentionally do something like this repeatedly to her, so the obvious answer is that Mr. Scratch somehow survived. Could he perhaps have survived American Nightmare, but only as an apparition that represents Alan's base desires and instincts and fears? It certainly seems possible. Those are most of the main characters and paranatural entities on the Alan Wake side of the Remedyverse, but I might as well rattle off some of the remaining in a quick list, as well as how likely I think it is they'll appear. The Taken. This depends entirely on whether the Dark Presence appears, but if they do, then these guys are near certainty. The Hiss. The main antagonists of Control. The only way I could see these guys appearing is if there was a sequence showing Alan some of the horrors he created during his time in the Dark Place, writing his escape. The Board/the Former. I've lumped these two together because they have basically the same likelihood and setup for appearing. I can only see these appearing if they decided to lay teasers for the plot of the Control sequel throughout, as the Foundation DLC seemed to hint that future plot points would focus on deciding a faction in the war between these two. The department heads, Pope, Aris, and Langston. Maybe they might appear, but only if Jesse themselves somehow appears. Dylan. It will have been 3 years since Dylan fell into a coma once Alan Wake 2 is released, but him awakening seems like it'd be a major plot point that they leave for the Control sequel. Hartman. Not a chance. He was taken over by the Taken and the Hiss, and Jesse put him out of action for good at the end of AWE. I can't see any way he could appear outside of a hallucination or flashback. Thomas Zane. Fairly likely, probably appearing as a tutorial vendor or a glorified upgrade menu, like the Prince in Resident Evil 8, if they go that route. Agent Nightingale. Again, depends on whether the Dark Presence returns. They seem to be hyping him up as the new avatar for the entity, so he'd probably appear in a sim role to Barbara Jagger in the first game. Rose. Maybe? I doubt to be anything more than a basic NPC if he were to reappear though. And finally, Alex Casey. He was seemingly written into reality during Alan Wake Remastered's bonus scenes, as an FBI agent working in New York City. Maybe that's the reason Alan is in New York in the trailer, unless he's going to the FBC. And that's all we have for today. I think I covered most of the characters and plotlines I think could appear in the sequel, as well as what I think the gameplay could turn out to be. but if I miss someone, then feel free to mention it in the comments. This obviously isn't very similar to the entirety of the rest of the content on my channel, but I've been wanting to spread out into other game franchises for a while now, and it was always going to be a Remedy vs Horizon Zero Dawn or Yokai Watch video, and late as this video is, Alan Wake 2 is a pretty massive thing that tipped my hand just a little bit. It'd be great if I could make more content on this topic, so as out of character as it is for me to ask you this, it'd be a big help if you could like and subscribe, and maybe join the Discord. I'm an excuse to add an Alan Wake channel now, and I'd like to be able to clarify some of my thoughts for what the future may hold for Wake there. This is the Dark Man, going dark.